All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the April 12th, 2023 meeting of SIG-Auth. Let's kick off. We have quite a few items on the agenda. First off, I just want to make a quick announcement in case you're at KubeCon or if you're able to join remotely. We do have the SIG-Auth deep dive. The link is provided. We'll love to catch up with folks. All right, I don't think there's anything other than the discussion topic. So first up, we have the external signing service account token cap PR.
So last time the feedback was if our motivation is just automatic rotation, we can do that through files. There's like an existing path to just have it pick up changes from disk. We don't want to do that. We don't want to have these keys on disk. The idea is to decouple this logic fully out of API server so that then you can have this separate key server component do whatever you want, like for example pull from KMS. So I listed a few of the use cases in there, but
right. So is it just two use cases? Rotation, which we already said wasn't like sort of valid for this one, and then out of process?
yeah, it's mostly around out of process so that that logic can be decoupled out of API server, and then people can extend it in the way that suits their needs.
So how does this relate to the fact that, for example, the Kube controller manager still has the on-disk stuff for the same, basically?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was thinking to have that out of scope of this, because I guess what's our long-term plan with those legacy tokens?
They're going to stay forever right now. That's the long-term current plan.
We don't auto-generate them anymore, but people can request them, and there is not a plan in place today to get those people onto a better system without breaking them. Basically, you have been able to request a token in a secret since 1.0, and there are definitely things built on top of that. And yeah, like we had a reasonable path for migrating the auto-generated ones, and that's basically done. We have some cleanup work to do there, but there's not a path for migrating explicit dependencies on the requested ones. We could maybe look at making the one, if you request a token in a secret, like moving the generation of that from the controller manager into the API server. That might be a possibility. But the nature of those tokens, I don't think we can change reasonably.
Because they're not expiring.
They are non-expiring,
Yeah. I mean, I think for the purposes of this cap, like you can have separate keys, like for the legacy tokens that don't expire, you can do a different key pair that maybe could be on disk. It's up to the operator of the API server if they want to trust that key pair or not. But that would still allow you for the temporary ones to basically not have a key that you have to hold on disk.
What does that give you?
That gives you a way to run Kubernetes without a exportable key.
But you still have the exportable keys just on the controller manager still. And it's the one that gives you tokens that last forever.
If the API server respects it, yes.
Oh, so you're going to break the core API on purpose and basically like fall out of conformance to do this.
I don't actually know if conformance.
Okay, if it doesn't, we'll go add that and make it.
Well,
Or give people the option to.
Okay, I mean, yeah, like, so I don't think it's out of scope. I think if you're going to try to fix it, you should actually try to fix it, right? So stepping back for a bit, is I also think, let me actually pause for a second. David, you wrote a comment there. You want to talk about that first? Since I think you wrote it before I started. There, David. I'll read David's comment, which is, would we recommend that require service account tokens are not usable between different clusters? Certainly can't enforce it. Can't enforce it today.
Can you repeat the question? I'm not sure I understood.
So David wrote a comment on the agenda, which is basically, Rita, do you want to put the agenda back on screen real quick? Which is basically, would we recommend or require that service account tokens are not reusable between different clusters, right? So if you have an external signer,
Yeah,
it's just some global service and maybe it just has one key or something, right? Now all your tokens are like completely reusable across clusters, right? That's not exactly the intent of this feature, right?
I
No.
mean, they
And
don't, they check existence of the service account object and that the UID matches. So like you couldn't use those tokens against the Cube API server or in a token review. Like it would complain and say,
I mean, okay, sure. Like, yes, if your UID generation never conflicts, which it really shouldn't, you should be okay. That's fair.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand like what keys are being used that are more powerful than access to the Cube API server would be. Like if you have access to the Cube API server, you can already do things. You could restart the Cube API server with another key pair so that it would like spit out tokens and accept tokens with that key pair. Like if you have that level of access, what risk are we mitigating? Is it a key that is trusted by other things for other reasons?
Yeah, it's mostly about just the exportability, right? Like if you have a key that, or a set of keys, even if you're rotating keys that are exportable, there's no audit process on those keys, right? And the API, the verifying of tokens signed by the API server that are used by other systems, say SIG-Auth somewhere, is going to have to trust the API server, or not necessarily the API server, but wherever you have the issuer endpoint for the trusted set of keys. So if a bad actor who control the API server does add a new rogue key, they also have to have access to the OIDC issuer or the public OIDC issuer, like verifier URL, right? Like and so like in the case of EKS, those are two different systems. And
you don't need to do that, right? Like you could just use like the request header stuff, right? The ability to just tell the API server who you are, so you can just impersonate any identity and just ask it to mint tokens. So they would get audited. You're right that it was totally, because it'd be following the regular path. There'd be a regular audit trail for this, but it doesn't prevent you from basically infinite abuse of the system in an online attack.
If I'm understanding correctly, this is for taking tokens you get from an API server and using them against another system that is not using token review,
right,
or verification. So another system just has a key set that it's verifying against, and presumably it's getting that key set from a different, more trusted or more audited system.
Right.
Okay.
Because then you have like, yes, an operator could potentially at one point create a rogue key, update an API server, mint a key, or mint a credential, have access to the API server, but they don't necessarily have access to the external system that those tokens are being used for.
Okay.
Right. And then so take the case of AWS. Even if I'm not running EKS, if I'm running COPS and I put my keys in an S3 bucket for my OIDC provider, that's not my Cube API server. Now if if I want to get cloud credentials, like AWS cloud credentials, by assuming some role with a token signed by the API server, I have to have the key. I have to be able to publish that key to the public endpoint. And it is now exportable, or it's not exportable now if you have a non-exportable key.
So
Just a quick time check. Just FYI, do we want to like time box this?
We had said we did. My take is that this is pretty niche. I see why it's important in like that narrow combination of use case, like tokens granted by Kube API server used somewhere else. I think the questions about Kube Controller Manager do need to be resolved. Otherwise, we are sort of like half fixing the problem in Kubernetes, and it doesn't really make sense. And like someone mentioned something about types of extending this, and that raises big questions for me. Like, I don't really want the token surface to be extendable. I'm not sure exactly what was meant by that. I think those have to be resolved. And given the list of what we have in flight, I would rather see us like finish some in progress things before we take on a new extension point. But that's my perspective.
So two things to add to that. I generally agree with Jordan there. One is, could you do this completely out of tree with just like a proxy in front of the API server to just sign stuff with whatever you want to, like intercepts the resource? You already have to do a layer 7 proxy if you want to intercept other things.
Like intercept the token request API.
You can already intercept everything, Jordan.
That's
what request header lets you do, right? Like that's kind of the point. I'm not saying it's a good recommendation, but if at the end of the day we're talking about a significantly complex feature that has like an incredibly niche use case, I'm kind of okay saying that you get an incredibly niche implementation, right? Maybe I'm kind of hand waving there a little bit. I haven't thought through that too much, but the other thing I wanted to suggest here to see if it was tractable is, so I'm generally like really not in favor of any more of these gRPC things being shoved into like core critical parts of the API server. Like I've learned my lesson from KMS. It's just a crappy thing. Don't do it. Don't add more. Is there a way that we could try to leverage that existing extension point to help in this regard somehow? So like having some kind of way to like chain the KMS to give you like a derived key or something, but something that's not on disk, but maybe in memory, maybe with some kind of TTL associated with it. So that way you can have similar properties, but the operation that's doing the signing doesn't require a remote RPC, right? Like that's like the core thing that KMS v2 does for us, is that it no longer has the remote thing in line to all the calls. So it's way less dangerous and way less likely to cause an outage. And I also think this thing will turn into a security checkbox that I'll be forced to check. And I really don't want to have outages because I'm asked to check as a checkbox. Anybody have any thoughts on that? I'm just reading the comments.
I mean, it's an interesting idea, but I have to think more about it. Like, does that solve your problems if you only have provide like a KMS encrypted key on disk that can be decrypted? Because it's still,
I mean, it would stay in process, right? The API server is not going to write it out. So it's got to stay in process, right? So I think at some point you can start saying that someone's not necessarily going to be able to get into the memory of the API server, but maybe if that's still in your threat model, then you get really painful.
Yeah, I mean, if they have access to the same identity as the, or whatever, whatever permissions that the process that's running the API server has to decrypt the token,
It's true.
they could do that. So it's still exportable.
Yeah, so in that sense, it's there. Sort of the way I've seen some of this stuff handled in like Azure AD and like GitHub is they use cert-based signing, and they issue intermediates that are short-lived. So you can't really meaningfully export those because they die very quickly, but they're not in line to the request, right? You ask for it, I think it goes through some kind of CSR flow, but you generate your local key, you ask for it to be signed, and you have an intermediate, and you get to use it for a certain amount of time. So obviously the root private key and all that stuff is sitting in the HSM, and that's long lived. And maybe you use cross signing to rotate it out whenever you feel like it. But inside the API server or inside whatever component you have, it's not present. The intermediate's present for however long. Like it could be as short as like 10 minutes, right? Because the point is to make it so that it's not in line. Like that's the core thing I want to try to avoid here. And yes, I agree with Jordan's time box because now we're at 20 minutes.
My guess is even a short reuse period doesn't satisfy that unexportable requirement. That's my guess.
Yeah.
I'm happy to talk about this face to face, and yeah, I am looking forward to seeing the folks who are there. Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
In terms of next steps specifically for the CAP, maybe noodling on the kube controller manager aspect, like what could we do there to maybe unify, or yeah, that's a specific thing that I think we need to answer.
Cool. We want to, Jordan, were you the one who wrote all these caps out?
Yeah, I did. Like I said, I'm not really expecting us to like leave today knowing like this is exactly what we're working on for 128, but I first linked to the open enhancements issues tagged with SIG-Auth just to remind us that there's a lot of stuff that isn't done yet that we kind of have in flight. And so as we want to look at spinning up new stuff, also let's try to make progress and complete some of the in-flight stuff. So that was just the first thing. Take a look there. If there are things you've been involved in, you kind of forgot about, are sitting there in beta, maybe look at what it takes to get to GA and if we can make some of those things happen. The second bullet was like it'd be helpful to know where things are in each stage. So some things need design, some things are already designed, and we just need to like implement them and make progress. Some things have implementations that need review. So whatever the work is that needs to be done, like the next step, what we're wanting to accomplish for 128, let's be really clear about like what the goal is for 128. Land a design or have an implementation and a review. And then we need to make sure we're load balancing folks. So like this isn't really like a wish list, like here's what I want to be in 128, but I'm not planning on working on. This is more like, here's what I'm planning to do in 128. So if I put a lot of question marks and kind of put names of people, but hearing from you all would be super helpful. Like, here's what you are planning to do, whether it's work on a design or work on an implementation. So I'm trying to take question marks off of things as people commit to them, or we get confirmation that people are planning to work on them. So that's kind of the overview.
And ideally, the ones that we want to focus on for 128 should be added to a milestone, right?
Yeah, I took a first pass on things that I am planning to work on, either as a reviewer or helping drive implementation, or that I knew I had seen other people like actively updating stuff on. So I took a first stab at milestones, but that's just a first stab. And then I roughly sorted this list in order of like things that were furthest along in the pipeline. So There were a couple things that the Who Am I API, very small surface area, pretty well understood, pretty much just mechanically stepping through the progression. So I think that one is a reasonable thing to target GA. I'm happy to review it, and I need to get confirmation. Oh, I see a someone in the chat. Hopefully this is a pretty mechanical graduation to GA that we can get in.
Yes, there are some tests required, like to improve coverage, and also maybe writing a blog post, but despite this, no obstacles.
Okay. The next one was the cleanup. This is actually around the legacy token use. So tracking of legacy tokens is a pretty mechanical graduation. That concludes sort of the easy steps of the cleanup. The hard step is actually doing the cleanup, using the tracking information to do the cleanup. So there's a implementation in flight. I'm on the hook to review it. I think there's a good chance of getting that to alpha in 128.
So we're gonna have a controller that goes around and deletes people's stuff. Yeah, it's gonna go so well. Okay, cool.
I don't know if we want to step through this. Sergey is not here. Did you want to talk about KMS v2? No.
I thought Sergey was here. I swear I saw him on. Maybe he had to drop. Oh, I thought he was here. Okay. Sure. So we can near the later part of the agenda is like what I'm highlighting here. Like I have some stuff I want to make changes to for KMS v2 to the crypto stuff. So in my mind, KMS v2 cannot go to GA in 128. Like I need 2 releases. Like I planned on making like some read level changes and then some write level changes. So I needed 2 releases to do that. Unless I wanted to add flags, and I didn't really want to add flags. I see David's comment about API machinery features. So what's still sort of up in the air about KMS v2 is how much we're gonna try to make be automatic. So like in terms of rotation. So if we're saying KMS v2 has to have like near completed automated rotation, then we gotta like finish all the storage version stuff. If instead we would pull that out maybe into its own thing and track it separately, then it would not necessarily block KMS v2 itself from going GA, right? So there could be a separate KEP that's basically like, here's the storage version API that does this right now, and here's the API server identity stuff that does this right now, and together, and add some enhancements, and here you go, here's a new KEP that says how we're going to do automated rotation. I don't know where I've landed on that yet. But I think those are like the 2 big things. We can come back to like crypto stuff. So let's see. Do we want to keep going to cluster trust bundle? See, I think to here.
Just to be clear, KMS v2 is staying at beta for 128 with ongoing work at beta, right?
Yeah, that's my plan, unless someone has some seriously different opinions.
Yeah, let's talk about cluster trust bundle.
So we have one more piece of alpha scope work to land, I think, in 128, which is the actual projected volume support. And then you talked about beta, but I think it makes a little more sense to land kubelet certificate support, like kubelet pod certificate support, and have them both be at alpha first so we can see how they play together. If that makes sense. So that was my kind of optimistic forward-looking plan. Was I have that draft cap about workload certificates. I want to turn that into a real cap. I'm working on a draft implementation as well, so hopefully it can go a little bit faster than this last time. I've learned some stuff about landing things in Kubernetes. So that was kind of my thinking, is try to first finish up the projected volumes on cluster trust bundles, and then simultaneously try to get an alpha of workload certificate projected volumes.
Okay. I'm not opposed to getting the projected volume in alpha first. I do think there's value in the API, even if we don't have the projected volumes, like just as a way to say, here's how you get the signing certificates for this, even if things were talking to the API directly. I think that's a useful API, even by itself. So delaying it.
Maybe the small hesitation I would have with that, Jordan, is what if we want to make changes to that API based on what we learned from implementing the kubelet volume count?
That's fair.
Yeah, and the thing, my interpretation is, I don't know, like, I'm not aware of anyone like actively planning to use it. Like, we have plans to use it from GKE, but that's all pretty much based on projected volumes, I think.
I mean, having an answer for people who are like, so you've got these Kubernetes signers for CSRs, that's awesome. Where do I get the CAs for those? Like, having a thing to point them at would be nice. That's something we've sort of just said, no opinion, talk to your cluster provider.
Wait, does this KEP cover actually filling out the trust bundles for the?
No, but the APIs are prerequisite for that.
Yeah, okay. So what you're saying is, if the API existed and the platform wanted to use them to expose those, they could in a reasonable way.
Then you could say, like, give me all the cluster trust bundles for this signer name. Like,
I'm hearing screaming.
Sorry.
But I don't feel that strongly if we want to focus on the projected volume and like really make sure we have that in alpha. That's fine with me.
Okay.
I'm a little more comfortable with trying to land a complete set first.
All right.
Who's going to be the reviewer for it?
I can review the API bits, but we need node and storage reviewers for the kubelet and volume bits.
What are the dates here?
Is it the same?
I
Sorry.
don't think we have dates yet.
I mean, typically the second release of the year ships in mid-August, so code freeze is mid-July, and design freeze is like mid-May ish.
Okay.
What I would guess.
I'll try to keep that in mind. I have an unfortunate habit of scheduling vacations right around the freeze. I don't know why that works out, but I'll try to keep those clear this year.
It's not a problem. Just we'll get everything done like a month early.
I'm trying to like look at, let's see, it would be 124, right? That we should look at for guidance on when code freeze happens normally. I guess really it's enhancement freeze that we want. I know this is wrong. This is in February. Maybe it's okay. I'm confused. Code freeze for 125 was August, like beginning of August, and enhancements freeze was near end of June. Does that sound right? No, that doesn't sound right, because KubeCon EU was until May that time, and now it's in like April. So maybe there's like a whole shift. I don't know. You've got some time, but not necessarily as much time as you think.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
that's a good general life principle. You have some time, but not as much time as you.
Okay, cool. Multiple authorization webhooks.
I'm very interested in this for two reasons.
Tell me.
would like to be able to run multiple authorization webhooks, and I would like to be able to control the failure policy on a webhook. Like right now, webhooks that there's an error calling them their timeout or something, authorizations like, well, no opinion, go on to the next authorizer. And I would like to be able to say, if this authorizer is unavailable, that counts as a times out. That's a fail closed. So I am interested. I can help with review, at the very least, maybe implementation or design, but I can sign up for some of this.
Jordan, do you hate me if I say I want to be able to configure them through the API?
Yeah.
But David, last time I talked to David, he seemed to want it too. And I have folks that want it.
Let me. So I don't want to couple the ability to run multiple webhooks to an API. If we also want to expose it via an API, I wouldn't want to run that API, but if someone wanted to work on exposing that optionally in a non-conformance way, I don't know. I probably wouldn't hard block it, but I would raise big eyebrows about like, why are we doing a thing that is optional in non-conformance and can't be relied on? And at least I wouldn't want to run in clusters I was responsible for.
I mean, if your customers ask you to, you might have to, right? It's kind of the gist of how these things go. Okay. Yeah, I don't know if I have had any asks for just the multiple bit, like the multiple, having more than one and then having the failure policy. I don't think I've necessarily heard too much about that. I have heard about, I want to be able to configure my own webhook on your cluster. So, okay. I see you're typing right now.
That's a good question, Tim. Being able to have some indication in the config, like only route this type of request to this webhook, where what that condition can consider is like open to debate. That's an interesting thing to settle in the design. I could,
to be fair, I asked for it. I kind of blocked it on it.
Yeah.
Hey, who's the implementer here? Is it?
There is none.
We don't know yet. We're still in the design phase, so pinning down the design is
Looking for one.
Yeah, but I did talk to like I think last coupon I talked to like Joe about like, could I reasonably use Cell for filters here, and he seemed pretty positive about that. And to me, I think if you're gonna have failed closed webhooks and more than one of them, you really probably want to filter to make sure that it only invokes it where it makes sense. Because this isn't like admission, it's going to break your cluster in a really special sort of way.
So I need to circle back to the current author of the pull request I linked and see if they can actually work on this release, and if not, then we need to have an alternate person to keep driving the design forward.
We don't have to think about it too much here. Jordan, is the whole discussion about being able to restrict system colon masters, is that in scope or out of scope for this?
Restrict to what?
Restrict system colon masters. Can a webhook reject that user or that group?
I think where we left this 4 months ago, I wanted a structure that could accommodate like ordering of the built-in super user authorizer in the future, but I wasn't gonna block on it to begin. Yeah, like today, it's implicitly at the front of the authorizers, and whatever else you specify, like node, webhook, RBAC, whatever, you can specify the order, and then the super user one shows up at the beginning. a structure in the config that says, here's the order I want everything to run in, and here's where in that order I want the super user one to go. I think it would make sense to have a structure that can accommodate that. There's a lot of assumptions built on super user always is first and can never be blocked. So we'd have to resolve those before we actually allowed a config that reordered that.
Yeah, like aggregated API servers that just hard code that group is allowed to do everything.
Or loop back API servers talking to themselves and assuming that they won't ever fail an authorization check, stuff like that.
Yeah. Okay. See, next one, if we're happy to go on, is the not structured authentication webhook. It's JAWT or OIDC, right? Not authentication webhook.
Is this a prerequisite for this one?
Which one? Which one is what?
Multiple authorization one? Is.
No, those are unrelated. Those are unrelated.
Okay.
So I plan on working on this coming release, and I'll probably drag Anish and Elec and someone else with me. And yeah. And I think some of the I'm forgetting his name, but a member of the community helped write up a bunch of tests that test the existing OIDC functionality, so that I want to get that merged sort of early in the 128 cycle, so we can have the CI signal. So if we start messing with this code, if we actually get to writing code this time around, we're not going to break stuff. So I think, Jordan, like probably you and I need to sort of like agree on the API surface sooner rather than later.
Okay, how about if we queue up some time next week?
Oh,
If-
fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure, we can do that.
We'll like arm wrestle over what we make a prereq. Yeah, for 128, honestly, if we settle on a design for this and got test coverage of the existing code in place, like I'd be pretty happy with that progress, even if the implementation didn't quite start yet. But
Max, I see you're on the call. Were you going to be able to devote time to working on it, or are you busy?
According to implementation, I think, so I feel like I can say that I'm confident enough that I will be able to implement this. I have time. But according to design, there are still many unaddressed questions, so that should be discussed.
Yeah, I mean, I think whatever we do, we have to just make sure that we don't risk the existing functionality. We got so if we write code that messes with the existing stuff, it needs to be really strongly gated, and ideally we don't mess with the existing stuff if at all possible. But we can figure that out. But yeah, I think that's the core thing, right? Is like, if you have an alpha implementation, it doesn't have to be perfect or done. It is alpha. That is what that means.
Yeah, I remember that there was a proof of concept or something that worked already. So, and this was a completely different authenticator, so not messing with other authenticators at all. So as I think
that was my initial plan, but then Jordan threw a wrench in there because he was like, Mo, make it so that you can like copy paste your existing CLI flags into this new config and it'll just work exactly the same. You know, like that's hard to do. Like, it's hard to do in the sense of like purely do it and make sure it never diverges from the other thing unless the other thing and this thing are the same code path. So thanks for that.
Okay.
But yeah, so that's the hard part, right? Is like, I had basically thought that we would just copy paste the existing authenticator and just start ripping it apart and making it do what we wanted. But that's really hard to do if we have to maintain perfect feature parity with the other one, or behavioral parity at least. So, but I understand where you're coming from on that, Jordan. I just, that wasn't sort of what was on my mind, but it sounds like very much traditional Jordan. Move slow, don't ever break anything, and assume everything.
I just assume we're going to be maintaining both of these forever. And so having two that diverge in subtle ways with not a real migration path from one to the other sounds like a nightmare for users actually and for us.
Yeah, that's fair. It's very fair. Yep. Okay. So fine-grained Auth-Z. I see David's comment that says Daniel's not going to work on this the 128.
Sorry, for the previous one, the review is it Jordan?
And Mo.
Okay.
Let's put Mo first.
Okay, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah, we can do that. Yeah. I think that one is fine. I think we'll, if we, Max, are you going to be at KubeCon by any chance?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, you are? Okay, that's excellent. So that way all right, I'll find you then.
Okay.
Tim, you were commenting on the multiple authorization webhooks. Would you be interested in helping review some of that as well?
Sorry, was that to me?
Yeah, sorry. For the authorization config, you had asked a question about the condition stuff. I didn't know if you want to help review some of that.
I'll be around for a couple weeks and can help review, and then I'm going to be
right.
out until August. So if this doesn't land in the 128 cycle, I'd love to be involved, but I'm probably not going to be around for much of 128.
Okay, I'm sorry, totally forgot.
Of course.
All right, the fine-grained Auth-Z one, I'm happy to drop that out.
I mean, I want it. It's super cool.
It is. We have a lot of work to do. I'm okay with reordering some things.
Yeah. Let's see. I know Rob is going to be at KubeCon, so we could talk to him about reference grant and see how we want to move forward with that. I think we had quite a lot of open questions about how this thing would work.
One of the reasons I actually want to try to wrap up some of the in-flight stuff is to free up bandwidth to think about sort of bigger system questions like the reference grant one. I think the reference grant proposal is like half of a solution, maybe less than half, maybe a third of a solution. It's like expressing a third of the intent, but then it relies on sort of controller implementations to do things and then actual authorization grants to those controllers to do things. And I wish we had time or attention to actually develop the whole solution for that space where you can express intent and it actually gives the authorization to the controller, and the controller has to make requests indicating I am doing this for this resource. And then the system says, you, the controller, can act for this resource, and that resource was granted, this access by this object. Like, those are kind of the three pieces, and the reference grant proposal is like a third of that. And I think what's actually going to happen for the other 2/3 is like controllers are going to get super broad permissions and maybe use our library to check those permissions, or maybe just do things and execute confused FUD attacks. So I think this is solving a real problem, but I would at least like to think about whether we can actually solve the whole problem, which will require more work. But Rob's not here. I think we should probably talk with Rob, and Nick, I think, was the one who opened the proposal.
Yeah, maybe we should at least, I know Rob's going to be at KubeCon, so we should at least try to talk to him some in person and see if we can come up with something. I generally agree with what you said. I'm just a little worried if we try to build the other 2/3 of it, it'll be like one of the largest kept SIG-Auths ever done. mostly because it's still like gonna have some kind of out of tree something. Like something's gonna, the things that are gonna use this are not in core, so we can't like enforce that they behave insane ways. Mm, 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 mm.
Tim, did you put the 2 cell ones on, or maybe you put the match conditions?
Yeah, I put both of those there. I wasn't sure if they should be on this list since they're kind of co-owned with API machinery, but they have some crossover to SIG-Auth, so I just want to raise awareness that these are both planned to go to beta in 128. For cell admission, I'd probably put Joe Betts as the lead for implementation, but there's a whole team of folks collaborating around that. Not sure who's on point for review.
Okay, I'm mostly counting on the API machinery folks to find reviewers. But yeah, thanks for throwing this on our radar.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are really excited for the cell admission stuff. It makes like an entire class of problems disappear.
For match conditions, I talked to Igor, is he still on the call, about driving this one. I'm going to try and get a PR out later this week for just to update the cap for beta. I think the other thing to note about this is it's dependent on cell admission control going to beta. So if it looks like that's not going to happen in 128, then that'll block this.
Sorry, who did you say was the implementer for this?
Igor Velichkovich.
Okay. Can you add the name later?
Yeah, I can put myself in there. It's a bit of a tough one.
All right, what's next? Mo, did you want to do the crypto stuff?
Yeah, we can. If we're done with Kep stuff, I'll try to make it not too long. You want to open up the doc? Okay. So if folks haven't read this thing yet, this is going to be kind of hard to follow along, but I'll do my best. So these diagrams describe sort of how KMS v2's crypto stuff works today in 127. So obviously the part where the remote KMS encrypts a data encryption key is sort of unchanged. But currently on startup and on key rotation, we do some fancy nonce calculation and sorry, I'm saying that wrong. When we use a data encryption key that has been encrypted by the KMS plugin, every time we do an encryption with it, we generate a new nonce. The nonce is both partially random and it has a counter. We are limited to 12 bytes because AES GCM is annoying. So that's kind of how it works today. So there was concerns around basically anything that could cause the counter to be reset in a way that is unexpected or reused in a way that's unexpected, primarily around any kind of technology that would restore the process to an earlier state and then have it run from that earlier point in time. then there's I've been reading up on sort of various guidelines around how long you should use a key for, basically how much data you should encrypt with it and how many encryption operations you should do. And all of that's based on like the size of the messages and all sorts of other stuff. But if you look at the most conservative estimates, they end up being on the order of like a couple of 100 gigabytes, right? So like you can actually very easily hit this limit on a high write load cluster, right? So I wanted to try to basically address, let me step back for a second. KMS v1 had none of these issues because it always made a new deck every time it was going to do an encryption. So it was always a new deck. So it had this horrible like failure mode where it always needed the remote plugin to be 100% available for every single call. But it didn't have any like cryptographic shortfalls. It just and it had a purely random nonce. So I wanted to come up with an approach that retains the existing minimal reliance on the external KMS, but restores more of the capabilities that V1 had from the crypto standpoint, while not sort of gaining the massive cache size problem that V1 also has. So like in order to function efficiently, you need like effectively an unbounded deck cache, because you just have one-to-one mapping. So this basically describes a scheme that's vaguely called nonce extension. So it's a mechanism for adding extra bytes that are used to derive subkeys, which is for example, it's done by I think it's called Chacha. Forget the name now. Chacha ciphers. Mike, I see you unmuted. Did you have thoughts?
Yeah, I'm trying to go back. Your primary concern is reusing the nonce when we're using a counter for the nonce?
So the nonce concern is if you snapshot a VM and then restore it, but you don't do it in a way that guarantees that the original VM never stopped immediately at the snapshot, right? Does that make sense? Like basically, this feature makes it so that you could write state into etcd that was at a particular counter state at like time 10, but at time 5 is when you took the snapshot, and then you restored the VM at that snapshot. So it's going to go from 5 to 10 again. So it's going to count back up, right? So all of those things that it encrypts further will have collisions. Or sorry, they have the potential of collision because there's only the 4 bytes of randomness.
Yeah, I mean, like there are plenty of protocols that use counters for nonce, including TLS. This isn't like a, new innovation here. I wonder how realistic this concern is.
Yeah, so that one I'm not super sure about. I think the gist though is that when it happens, it's completely catastrophic, right? Like
it two things that write to disk? Yes,
2 things that write to disk. So if you have a single nonce collision, you immediately leak the authentication key. And I think you only need like a handful of collisions to leak the full key. You have to do like more complex math, but yeah, you end up losing the actual encryption key. And because we're using the same deck for all of them, you basically lose the entire backup. Right, like that's the real issue, is that even if this happens 0.01% of the time or 0.001%, in those cases, the whole system falls apart. Right, so right now the KMS v2 docs basically say, do not use VM state restores with this feature because we can't guarantee that it'll work exactly like you expect.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to think through a scenario, the full scenario. Okay, I understand the concern now. I have to mull on it, but thank you.
Yeah. So that's just one of the concerns. The other concern is basically, depending on who you ask, they give you very different numbers on how often you should keep using the deck. So I wanted to come up with something that didn't involve more remote calls to the KMS plugin while giving us like more unique decks. So the design basically says we'll just use an HKDF with a salt that we store aside, like a public salt that we store with the existing nonce. And when I get around to actually making an actual PR for this, I'll have all the links to the stuff where I looked at this stuff. But the scheme is generally known as like a nonce extension scheme, right? Is that we can go back to having purely random nonces because we no longer have to worry about collisions. But your derived key is mathematically unrelated to the original key because of how like the hash works, but it's deterministic based on the random salt plus the original key. So, but it's kind of complicated, and I don't necessarily expect folks to like grok it without spending some time thinking about it. Also on the whole nonce counter is pretty common. I don't think most of those things write stuff out to disk in a way that you can observe the collision outside of like the protocol. Also, I think TLS does use a PRF like in this way, in a similar way. It doesn't use a full HKDF, but it does use a pseudo-random function to derive keys.
To derive the keys, but then the sequence numbers for like ASGCM are the nonces. For the TLS record numbers are the nonces for the in the ASGCM cipher suite.
Right, but
and it's
keys
just
being
like
rotated, right?
And they don't even have that randomness that we add, because we are, adding that prefix to the nonce. So only in your PR, there's some prefix that is still random. So,
Right. But what I was trying to get to is the pseudo-random function used in TLS gives you like derived keys, right? So that's kind of, I think, where TLS gets its safety, is it doesn't, like, it's not, even if it had a nonce collision, it's not likely to happen on the same derived key. If I understand it correctly. But I might be wrong. I haven't looked at how all the guts of TLS and the PRF work there.
Well, I mean, it's just the same as the deck, right? The session key is like the deck here, and it's how long TLS connection is open is how long we reuse the deck, which is 3 minutes right now in the current implementation or whatever.
Now we reuse the deck forever. It's only on the remote KMS plugin being offline and not responding to us with its current key ID that we stop using it.
Oh, when did that happen? That was not in the revision.
You reviewed the PR, Mike.
Yeah.
Okay.
We change the deck on when the key ID changes or when the API server process restarts.
All right. I thought we still had the 10 minutes in the last revision that I reviewed.
There is no TTL at all. It's forever.
Okay.
Right. So
good that we're staying in beta, and sounds like we have conversations to have.
Yeah,
we are at time actually.
But yeah, I can put this on like maybe not the next SIG-Auth agenda because I don't think I'll be here for that meeting, but like the one after that, and we can chat again or whatever. But I do want to come to like a decision on this in 128. Like I don't want to have that restriction and the scary messages on the KMSV thing forever. Like that does not scream production ready.
Yeah, good thing we're not going in GA 128.
Yeah.
Okay, I moved the rest of the topics to the following week. So sorry, folks, if we didn't have a chance to get to. All right, I think that's it. All right, thanks everyone.
Well.